Hi, it's November 5th, 2025, and I'm back with another video. There's a lot of things that I want to talk about, and I'm kind of running behind actually. But since Dick Cheney's death has come up as the latest news story, I think I'll lead with that. One of the main things that he's praised for is his great shepherding of George W. Bush when Cheney was vice president. George W. Bush was not known to be a genius, and Dick Cheney was seen as his kind of guide and mentor. But that's probably what the mainstream media is telling you. But the reason why he's disliked so much is mainly because of his responsibility for the war in Iraq in 2003, where he insisted up and down that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons, and he was working on nuclear weapons, and that's the reason why they took him down. Why the U.S. that was the reason why they took Iraq down. But I want to talk about a couple of other things. I just saw a video by this fellow named Jeff Rich, who has a podcast called Burning Archive, and he points out in his video, and I'll include the link to it, that Dick Cheney was instrumental in creating the Cold War. He pointed out that when the Soviet Union was in its kind of, you might say, death throes, and Gorbachev was making, what can I say, he was engaging in trying to restructure the Soviet Union to be better, but in reality what he was doing was taking it apart. And he wanted to end the Cold War with the naive idea that the United States was open to, having an era of peace. Nothing could have been further from the truth. But in any case, that's what Gorbachev thought. And Dick Cheney and Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor, I believe, at that time, and George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, they were debating all these questions, and the main discussion was: should we try and get along with the Soviet Union? Should we try and help it in its transition towards a capitalist economy, or should we just destroy the country? And Dick Cheney clearly came down on the side of let's destroy the country. So anyway, Jeff Rich makes the case for that pretty well, based on a book that was very well researched by a Russian researcher who had access to the archives. So there's that aspect of it, which was an important aspect which has been overlooked. But even more so, which is kind of amazing to me, is the fact, what I would say, that Dick Cheney is the architect of the Russian hypersonic missiles. What can I possibly mean by that? Well, Dick Cheney was the vice president under George W. Bush, and in 2002, right after Bush became president, suddenly the United States decides to walk out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which had been negotiated during the 1970s. That treaty was designed to, you could say, make solid the idea of MAD, mutual assured destruction. So both the Soviet Union and the United States had massive numbers of nuclear missiles, and the United States had always planned a first strike against the Soviet Union, going way back even to 1945. So Russia responded after 1949, it exploded its first atomic bomb, and then it rapidly developed the hydrogen bombs. And of course, the Soviet Union launched a missile into space as the first Earth satellite. But if you could launch a satellite into orbit, you can also launch a nuclear weapon to go halfway around the world and obliterate, to use Trump's terms, Washington D.C. or wherever in the United States. So in the 1970s, Nixon had this idea that we should create something called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was negotiated, and Ray McGovern, actually, who's one of the main speakers these days in the alternative media, very, very, knowledgeable person. He was at the signing of that treaty in, I think it was 1972. Well, Dick Cheney decides that we don't need that treaty anymore. They walked out of it, which is a complete, bad exhibit of bad faith by the United States. At that time, of course, Vladimir Putin was the president of the Russian Federation, and he said, please, don't. This is not a good idea. This is destabilizing. They said, none of your business. We're going to create this to protect ourselves from Iran, even though you had to be an idiot to think that that was true. And the reality is that when they made it clear, when Bush, I would say under the guidance or tutelage of arch neocon warmonger Cheney, lifelong warmonger Cheney, walked out on that treaty, Vladimir Putin said, well, we're just going to have to take countermeasures. If you're going to create missiles that can take down our nuclear missiles, we'll just make better missiles that you won't be able to take down. And what has happened? That was in 2002. Here we are in 2025, and Russia has just demonstrated the Burevestnik missile, which is a nuclear-fueled cruise missile, which can operate for months at a time, because nuclear energy is far more powerful than any kind of chemical energy that is available, and so that's one major advance which the United States has no answer to. And they also announced Russia announced the Poseidon missile, which is it's a torpedo launched by a submarine from very deep in the oceans where it's virtually undetectable, and it has apparently up to a 100 megaton bomb, which is the largest bomb that has ever been exploded. In early on during the Cold War, the Russians exploded something called the Tsar Bomba, which had a 50 megaton explosion, and it was just an absolutely enormous explosion, which dwarfed the average, let's say, 1 megaton. If you can imagine, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had kilotons worth, that is thousands of tons of TNT. Now with hydrogen bombs, we're talking about 1 million times TNT in some cases, or 5 million times. The Russians exploded a 50 megaton, 50 million tons of TNT bomb. It's absolutely enormous. And now they're talking about having a 100 megaton warhead, which, if exploded off the coast of a country, would create a tidal wave so great that it would basically wash away the coastal areas where it was, anywhere near there. So Dick Cheney, thinking that he was going to take down the Soviet Union to get control of its resources, this was a huge miscalculation on his part, and it should be noted that he is almost certainly, he along with his neocon pals, almost certainly responsible for the current state of Soviet, or rather Russian, and U.S. relations. So I think I just wanted to get that point out of the way. People talk about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and how bad Dick Cheney was, but his rap sheet goes back further than that. So that's what I want to talk about there. Now, I want to move on to the situation in Ukraine, because, as I have mentioned before, I have a friend living in a city in Ukraine, and she and her mother are living there now, and she's basically there to take care of her mother. I met her here in Chiang Mai, and she tells me some very, very interesting things, which you will never hear on the major media networks. She said that she grew up in the Soviet Union, and she has fond memories of that time as a young person. I think she was around 15 years old when the Soviet Union ended, but during that lead up to when the Soviet Union ended, she had a very nice life, according to her and according to her mother. They seriously regretted the Soviet Union's the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's one issue that you've probably never heard of. She's living in a country now that has been taken over by Nazis, according to her expressions to me. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the economy in Ukraine collapsed, and she decided to try her luck in Canada. So she and her then husband went to Canada. They were living there, and she found out that there were a lot of Ukrainian expats. Who were these expats? They were people who were escaping from war crimes prosecution by the Soviet Union because of the atrocities that they committed during World War II. Their ideology is Ukrainian racial supremacy, and Russians are considered Colorado beetles, insects, and they have a visceral hatred towards anything Russia, and that is you could say the core psychological reason why we have this war that has been going on in Ukraine since 2014, when the United States empowered those people to overthrow the democratically elected government, start attacking Russian-speaking people, and eventually, of course, after 8 years of deliberately failing negotiations, Russia went in and said, look, we can see you're about to launch a huge ethnic cleansing campaign with the NATO weapons that have been provided to the Ukraine government, and we're not going to allow that. So that was the basis of this whole war in Ukraine. Now, for some reason, I said to her, because she was here like a year or two ago, I said, are you sure you want to go back to Ukraine? Because you know what's going on there. She said she understands, but she's had to take care of her mother. So she's back in Ukraine now, and I asked her, what's it like? And she said, you cannot talk with anybody, because if you do, you're going to be, hauled in, and you're going to be in big trouble. So she can't really talk with anybody. She's talking with me on an internet connection, which apparently doesn't get scrutinized. So she feels, that's okay to talk with me. But I'm outside of Ukraine. She can't talk with people inside of Ukraine safely. She also says that it's quite clear that the Ukrainian army is failing, and that a rabbi that she has heard of in one of the cities in Ukraine is predicting that the war will end by January 15th. That is, that the Ukrainian army is going to completely collapse, and instead of having to fight, pitched battles in large cities, the government itself and the whole army will implode, and the people are desperately tired of this war. They didn't want this war in the first place. They voted for Zelensky, who campaigned for peace, and as soon as he got into office, which is typical, he changed his tune, and now he's a completely war crazy president, so-called president, because he overstayed his mandate as president, and there haven't been elections. So he's an unelected dictator of this country, sending tens of thousands of Ukrainian young men, mostly young men, to the front line to get killed. And Russia has attempted negotiations on a number of occasions, and they've gotten the door slammed in their face. So that's the nature of things in Ukraine. Let's see. One of the things that really struck me was her mother, as I say, had some fondness for the Soviet Union, and both of them consider themselves to be Russian. They consider Ukraine to be Russian, at least that area of Ukraine, because she said it's a Russian city where she lives. All the people speak Russian there. And the architecture is Soviet-era architecture. She said it was a very beautiful city, which the Soviet Union built. And so, but she said when she talks with her mother about the situation, and I'll kind of close the discussion on this note. Her mother is very, very angry at two people right now. She's very, very angry at Zelensky for continuing this war. And the second person she's really, really angry with is Vladimir Putin. And why is she angry at Vladimir Putin? Because she thought that Putin could finish this coup government off in 4 months in 2022, and it's taken 4 years, and it's still going on and on and on. So she's angry with Putin for not bringing their part of Ukraine back into Russia where it really belongs. So any of you who have this silly idea that Ukraine is this poor innocent actor that Russia invaded unprovoked simply have been listening to too much Western media propaganda. It's simply not true. And I can say that because I know people who actually live in Ukraine and tell me this stuff. Now, granted, the fact is that in this discussion that Jeff Rich gave, which I referred to earlier, he points to the participation of the National Endowment for Democracy in Ukraine going back, 30 years. And they are a propaganda and regime change organization. So the people in Ukraine have been, even though they were basically positive towards Russia during the Soviet era times, when you're subjected to years and years of anti-Russia propaganda, eventually you start to believe that. And so there are, and I meet Ukrainians who are very anti-Russia, and these are younger people, especially younger people, who simply they just don't know. They never lived in the Soviet Union. They've been poisoned by literally decades of Western propaganda, and so that's a problem. How it will all pan out, we'll just have to see. But it appears to me that Russia is going to win when this whole, in 2022, when this war, entered its really hot phase. I had friends telling me, oh, Russia invaded unprovoked and it's going to lose. And I said, no, it was not unprovoked and Russia's going to win. And here we are. And my friend who's living right in Ukraine is saying, it's looking really, really grim for Ukraine. I just saw a clip of somebody, a Ukrainian soldier. They're taking these young guys off the street, throwing a uniform on them, giving them a gun with a few bullets in it, and sending them off to the front where they're going to get slaughtered. And Zelensky doesn't care because he's raking in cash, which is coming in, from the European Union, and it had come in from the United States. He doesn't care. He's just in it for the money. The guy is. He's like, he's like the biggest traitor that ever could possibly have been foisted on the people of Ukraine. It's really terrible, but that's how it is. So, what else do I have to say here? Maybe I should call it quits for now. There are other topics that I wanted to get into. I want to talk about something called continuity of agenda, in which I refer to the fact that if you take a timeline back to the foundation of the United States, how it has conducted itself towards the Native Americans, how it's conducted itself in its foreign policy, and we're talking about all the way through up until World War II and to the present. Is there kind of like a cultural stream, a cultural thread that goes through all the way from the very, very beginning to now? And I think this needs to be discussed because people When you talk about slavery or genocide of the Native Americans, they say, "Oh, that happened long ago," and that what relevance does that have? And, well, I say that it does have relevance. So I'll be talking about that in another video. But for now, I'll call it quits. Thanks again for listening to this. Dick Cheney was not. It was not just about weapons of mass destruction. He was directly involved in the 9/11 attacks. He was directly involved in starting this war with Russia, where nuclear weapons are becoming, increasingly dangerous. And the mainstream media has not talked about either of those aspects, which I think is interesting. And even the alternative media has not talked about it. So that's about it. And if you want to support my channel, I really appreciate it. You can just, make a subscription on Substack, or you can make a donation through Buy Me a Coffee, or you can buy one of my information billboard T-shirts, which is supposed to spread love and awareness to all beings. You wear the T-shirt, maybe someone will notice it, and you can strike up a conversation with them and spread some awareness, which is sorely lacking in society nowadays. So thanks again for listening. I'll talk with you soon.